Hello everybody and welcome to episode 2, How the Study of Weapons Contributes to a Better Understanding of the Early Medieval Period. The Long Morning, a famous summary of the early medieval period spoken by Paul Dutton, a professor of humanities at Simon Fraser University, encapsulates a new perspective on what was once considered to be the Dark Ages. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the cohesion of Europe disintegrated into small independent kingdoms. The population, technological, and agricultural decline of late antiquity continued. Until recently, scholars believed that it was not until the year 1000 that these negative trends of decline were gradually reversed through population growth, the spread of diverse agricultural techniques, and the establishment of medieval trading networks. Through academic and archaeological investigation, it is now generally agreed that the uptrend towards the modern period began closer to the year 800 or even 700 ACE. The spread of papal authority throughout Europe, the rebirth of imperialism, and the establishment of the Benedictine order, key institutions of the middle and late medieval periods, can trace their foundations to the early medieval period. The study of historical artifacts relies primarily on two sources of information: the archaeological context and the literacy records. Early medieval cultural context has been easier to interpret from historical records thanks to the widespread burial custom of material interment with the deceased. The important thing to remember is that it is extremely imperative not to draw inaccurate assumptions when studying collections of artifacts recovered from grave sites. Underwood makes clear in his book Anglo-Saxon Weapons and Warfare that it is essential not to fall into the trap of assuming that the grave goods in which the dead were buried represent a cross-section of their possessions in life. The selective nature of Anglo-Saxon burials, for example, would seem to support Underwood's warning. When viewed as a system, Anglo-Saxon burials appear to make hardly any sense from a warfare perspective. Graves have been excavated with shields, but no weapons. In some cases, 2 shields have been recovered from those unarmed burials. This clearly indicates a selective process used by the Anglo-Saxons when preparing a burial. Unfortunately, the reasons for these selections are still unknown. A typical Anglo-Saxon blade forged in early medieval Europe comprised of a 2-edged iron blade with a typical length of between 86 cm and 94 cm, including the tang, the back portion of the blade which fits into the hilt. The manufacturing process of the blades during this era was complicated by the poor quality materials available at that point in time. Iron is created by heating iron ore to a high temperature in an oxygen and reducing environment. Due to the primitive forges available during this period, it was impossible to heat the ore to a sufficient impurity-reducing temperature. Consequently, the iron had to be forged using methods created in the early Iron Age. The metal had to be forged in small sections that would later be combined into a single unit. The metal could be beaten into a thin sheet of metal. That would then be stacked upon each other in a lamented fashion, or formed into rods that were joined together to form a blade. And forged, the finest quality blades made during this period were created by a process called pattern joining. The strips of forged iron were twisted together and further forge welded. This process removed surface slag, which would have been a weakening factor for the finished blade. The scabbard of the sword was intended to protect the blade from the surrounding environment. It was also intended to be retained in oil and grease coating, necessary to keep the blade in pristine condition. The scabbard also protected the wielder from self-inflicted injury. In general, the Anglo-Saxons used wooden scabbards bound by leather. Metal bindings were likewise used on the neck of the scabbard, secured by a single rivet. This rivet could be decorated in various patterns, possibly as a mark of status or the wielder's prowess with the blade. Due to a lack of surviving sources, the fighting styles used by Anglo-Saxon warriors remains uncertain. The later published Viking sagas indicate that the Anglo-Saxons preferred downward striking blows that were aimed at the neck, head and shoulders. These would have been fatal blows. For non-killing blows, the Saxons appear to have aimed for the legs and shield arms. Mail armour has rarely been recovered intact from the early medieval period. However, Underwood notes, it should be noted that this does not necessarily reflect its availability during that period. Mail armour recovered from periods when it is known to have been in widespread use is also very rare. The only complete mail shirt found to date in England is the one from Sutton Hoo, Suffolk. Due to its poor condition, it has been very difficult to conduct detailed examinations. The rings that comprise the shirt are 8 mm in diameter, some of which are closed with copper rivets. This could indicate that the mail was made of alternative rows of riveted and forged welded rings. Measurements of the shirt have concluded that the shirt was at least hip length and would have weighed at least 11 kilograms. In Denmark, a similar shirt was recovered from a dig in Vermoise. The shirt consists of over 20,000 riveted iron rings. This mail shirt dates from the 4th to 5th centuries. The quality of forged rings was also a significant factor. Mail armour would have afforded the user a significant degree of protection against most weapons that were used during the early medieval period. Even with this high level of protection, no armour can fully protect from significant direct blows. Mail, however, can partially absorb the impact. The wearer may be injured, but a fatal consequence would be avoided. This gives an armoured warrior a distinct advantage over an unarmoured warrior on the battlefield. Because mail armour has a tendency to rust, constant maintenance and careful storage would have been essential. We know from Byzantine sources mail armour was stored in leather cases. Like the scabbards, leather lined with sheepskin would have been able to retain the grease and oil that was applied to the mail. This would have helped in keeping it in good condition. A major disadvantage to a warrior using mail armour would have been the weight. Because the majority of the weight would have been borne by the shoulders, even the most fit individual would have struggled over a long-distance engagement or a battle upon a steep incline. The shield of Anglo-Saxon warriors was constructed from a circular wooden board, the centre of which was fixed on an iron boss. Covering the shield was leather and decorated fittings made from iron and bronze. During the excavation of Anglo-Saxon graves, an impression in the soil seems to indicate that it was common practice for a warrior to be buried with his shield. By measuring the impression left on the soil, we are able to determine the diameter of these shields and compare them to their European counterparts. This evidence would seem to suggest that these shields varied in size significantly. By investigating the size of Anglo-Saxon shields, we are able to identify a gradual change in the nature of conflict. There is a clear indication that these shields became larger as time went on. In comparison to the European shields, many of which have survived, Anglo-Saxon shields appear to be much smaller, even with this gradual size increase. It has been noted that this may not necessarily represent a divergence in transition. It is simply that larger shields, as outlined by Underwood in Anglo-Saxon's Weapons and Warfare, may have been placed upright against the side of the grave rather than horizontally on the floor. This means that due to the destructive nature of excavation, it would be impossible to identify shields of a larger construction. It is also clear that the thickness of European and Anglo-Saxon shields varied. Measured thickness has been noted between 5 mm to 12 mm. The shield would have often been covered in leather in order to reinforce its structure and integrity. As noted beforehand with armour, Anglo-Saxon armour, even though it was durable, it was not infallible. The shield was also required to ensure maximum protection. Consequently, they had to be manufactured from the sturdiest material available to ensure durability. There is evidence to suggest Anglo-Saxon shields may have even been painted. Whether or not this indicates social importance or represents a militaristic function is still debated within the academic community. Excavation of Danish shields from the early medieval period have revealed traces of paint. This could indicate that this tradition was a cultural custom rather than a universal one. At the centre of Anglo-Saxon shields was the iron boss. The boss was responsible with protecting the warrior's hand while grasping the shield. The most common form of boss was carinated and developed from a European tradition during the 5th century after the exodus of Rome. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons would have eventually developed their own version. The manufacturing method of the carinated boss is still unclear, but it is likely that it is manufactured from a single bullet of iron. Located behind the boss was the shield's grip. The majority of excavated grips have been nothing more than a short strap of leather. The grip was secured to the shield through riveting. A minority of recovered shields were furnished with much longer grips. In conclusion, the similarities of Anglo-Saxon weapons and armour would indicate that high levels of continuing communication and trade between Anglo-Saxon England and Europe continued after the collapse of Rome. It has been noted through archaeological investigation that Anglo-Saxon weapon technology changed at a slower pace than their European counterparts. It has been argued that the reasons for this slower pace of development was that it was unnecessary and that warfare itself had changed relatively little. Underwood notes that the Anglo-Saxons were forced to reduce this technical gap during the Viking invasions.